you very much, Mr. Secretary, that you've agreed on a short notice to be on this program. We've had the opportunity of interviewing many scholars, scientists on the topic of peak oil, but never before someone in your status, twice Secretary of Defense, also the founder of our energy department, what would you think a peak oil mean to an average audience?
Unfortunately, too little. It is going to take years, perhaps decades, to adjust to the inability of the world to increase the production of oil in the future. Ever since World War II, the growth of the international economy has been dependent upon the exploitation of what has been cheap oil. And that is going to end. And that will be disturbing to a public that has expectations that growth will continue. In the current recession, they may have adjusted that hope or expectation. But peak oil is going to have a substantial effect, most notably here in the United States, where we have 240 million light vehicles dependent upon the internal combustion engine. And there is no widespread understanding of that in the American public. There's a glimmer of understanding in the political process, but politically it's risky to discuss it.
The peak oil, let's step into the future. Perhaps Dr. Robert Hirsch talks about 2 to 5 years, we'll probably witness a shortage of supply. Now, it is very refreshing to have somebody that had experienced the 70s. Mm-hmm. You were in the office in the 70s, early 70s, you were Secretary of Defense with President Ford, President Nixon, and then you experienced the rationing, what we went through after the oil embargo with the Saudis. I would like to see what that experience was like and kind of give an idea of what it's going to be like from now on for at least the next decade until we find a way to mitigate the situation. That is a compelling issue that most people don't get, and coming from you hopefully will help them understand and prepare for it.
Well, the first point to be made is we really don't know when the peak comes. And we suspect it's not a peak but a plateau, and that you will not be able to raise production, but you will still have a substantial level of production. The public will suddenly discover that oil prices are rising, gasoline prices are rising. It's more inconvenient than it was before to drive. The reaction in the 1970s was one of panic. The immediate reaction was drive to the gasoline station and fill up. And since if every one of those 240 million vehicle owners drives to the station and fills up, you have a sudden shortage.
Immediate shortage.
An immediate shortage. Now, the fact of the matter is, you've got just as much gasoline as you had before, but it's been drained out of the system, and as a consequence you have lines waiting at the gasoline stations, and the panic spreads. If we acted more sensibly, and one does not count on sensible action in moments of fear, then we would not have had the same kind of gasoline lines that we had at the time. I don't think we will have that as a result of peak oil. We may have episodes of similar episodes, but basically what we're going to just discover is that the gasoline prices rise, people get more and more uncomfortable, they demand that the politicians do something. Politicians won't have that much that they can do, but there will be. Having cheap energy for this last half century and more has been a godsend, but we've been cruising through our capital, and we are going to be in a difficult position as we are not able to respond to increasing demand from China, Japan, India, and like the new countries of the world.
Now, going back to the 70s again, before we go forward, we experienced peak oil for the first time in the United States of all places. A country that was producing nearly 9 to 10 million barrels a day, as Hubbard kind of forecasted, saw that in 1956, that we're going to have a peak oil production in the United States. And lo and behold, it happened in the early 70s. There are indications that potentially all the data, of course, is available to our policymakers and to the CIA and everybody else, that it appeared that your generation began to do something, especially under you, Mr. Secretary, that you really thought, okay, we're going to have a peak globally somewhere down the road, 20, 30 years down the road. So you founded this seed under President Carter administration. Why wasn't that continued? If that would have continued, just as I was listening to your talk today, potentially we would have been at least partially independent today. Why are we so short-sighted, in your opinion, as you see things?
Well, that's the way God made the human being. The human being does not necessarily follow day after day what he believed a few days earlier. And that was the case in the 1970s. It was not the first problem that we had, the oil embargo. It goes back to an earlier period. But it got the attention of the public, and gradually we forgot all about it. Because there was plenty of oil to be imported, and it just seemed to be an unnecessary alarm, and people got to worrying about other things during the 1980s.
Now, in your talk today, you talked there is a necessity for a political order to do something, and at the same time you expressed skepticism that whether or not that's going to happen given our entire system, a political system. Now, Mr. Secretary, if you were the president today, and barring that you didn't want to be reelected as at that expense, how would you go about, what would you say to an average American about their future? What does the government have to do? What do we have to do to at least mitigate the negative effect of the shortage of oil?
The biggest problem that the United States has is its dependence on the internal combustion engine. And these can be replaced. They can be replaced with engines which we have not yet designed in a cost-effective manner with electric power. And we should be encouraging the conversion of existing vehicles. It's different from talking about hybrid vehicles, which we produce a few 100,000 a year. We need to begin to convert existing vehicles and, if necessary, subsidize that conversion. But I believe that it may be cost-effective, actually, to convert existing vehicles, at least the newer vehicles.
Do we have to have a certain oil price to really justify the investment, the capital requirement?
We probably should adjust oil prices. It will help facilitate that conversion.
So as we look into the future, possibility of oil prices staying in a triple number, 100 plus, we don't know where it's going to go. The impact on our economy at the moment, we're trying to build our economy back and put people back to work and so forth. how's that potentially going to play out? Or do you see a period of maybe a decade or so where the Europeans say steady state economy, where we should get used to having having a GDP of plus or minus 1% and not a growth of 7 or 8% for a while? Do you see that happening as there is more talk in Europe that Europeans are potentially embracing more of that? Assuming it's going to happen, where we in the United States still saying, okay, we're going to get the 7 or 8% GDP growth and so forth. Do you see a future where we should be more restrained from expecting more from our economy?
Well, I think that the expectations are much too ambitious about, first of all, the recovery.
Yes.
And secondly, how that recovery plays out, because as demand builds up in China and India in particular, but elsewhere in the developing world, there will be increasing pressure on the oil supply, prices will rise, and we are not prepared for the impact just on income levels here in the United States. Energy represents a substantial part of the average person's budget, like 15%. And if the price of energy goes up, they have less to spend on new television sets. And there will be a substantial adjustment of the economy.
The last question is that potentially this is not just going to be an issue for the United States, be it, of course, we're more dependent on foreign oil than many other countries. It's going to be a global event. Do you see potentially a world summit happening where we come to reality, the producers, the consumers sit down together and have a global policy of going through this period together? Do you see that happening given the political environment that we see in the world?
I think that to some extent, to a modest extent, that will occur. But it will be only at the margins, because the conflict of interest between the producers and the consumers is such that when the producers have the upper hand, they like to make use of it. When the consumers have the upper hand, they may like to make use of it. So there will be conferences. There will be bloated statements at the end of conferences. They will be helpful to some extent, but no, they will not represent a real reconciliation between consumers and producers.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you.